Rhetorical analysis is a pretty fundamental part of AP Lang. For anyone who's taken that, you have to do a rhetorical analysis for your AP test. It's also a pretty major part of first year composition in college. It's important to understand how this works, not just to accomplish that particular assignment, but because of the benefit of understanding rhetoric in general and being able to understand other people's arguments, what they're doing to persuade us, to convince us to take action that we might not otherwise take. This helps us to better understand people, and it also helps us to better express ourselves and make better arguments for things that we believe in and ideas that we want to advocate. At its core, rhetorical analysis is pretty simple. All that you're asked to do is take any communication, any document, figure out what's being said, and determine how effective it is accomplishing that message or achieving its purpose. Everything achieves its purpose. Any communication does that through the use of rhetoric. So whether it's rhetorical appeals, ethos, pathos, and logos, or rhetorical devices, which you might be familiar with if you've taken a literature class or if you've analyzed poetry, looking at things like alliteration, repetition, consonants, all that sort of thing. Those are all rhetorical devices, and those are the exact same ideas that you're going to be looking at for rhetorical analysis. However, when you do a rhetorical analysis, the number of things that you look at changes depending on what kind of document, what kind of communication it is that you're analyzing. And that analysis is important because it's not just enough to point out what the rhetorical devices are, but you also have to be able to explain how those rhetorical devices are creating an effect, what that effect is, and be able to appraise the effectiveness of those devices in accomplishing the goal or the message of whatever document it is that you're looking at. So the three types of rhetorical analyses that you can do are either a textual analysis, a visual analysis, or a multimodal analysis. The difference between those three is that they use a different number of modalities. And a modality is really just a way of communicating a message or a way that a message is received. So those four modalities are verbal, auditory, visual, and haptic. Verbal just relates to the use of words to communicate a message, whether those are spoken words, written words, song lyrics, whatever. That's all verbal. Auditory refers to any communication that you have to listen to. So again, a song, spoken words, a commercial, background music, those things are part of your auditory. Visual, anything that you have to look at. So a commercial, a poster, if somebody's giving a speech in person, if they're using body language to convey certain ideas or to convey their emotions, that's also part of the visual communication. And then haptic just has to do with the sense of touch. The most common way that we experience that is through our cell phones, probably getting feedback from that cell phone. Haptic tends not to come up as much in rhetorical analysis, so typically you're just looking at verbal, auditory, and visual. And the three kinds of rhetorical analyses that you can do depend on how many of those modalities are present in the communication. So for this video, I'm just going to be focusing on doing a textual analysis. And if we consider any piece of text that is written words that we have to read, then we would be looking at the verbal modality because there are words there. And we'd be looking at the visual modality because we have to physically look at that paper in order to read it. That's going to come in handy later when I actually go and dissect how I would go about doing a textual rhetorical analysis. But I just want to set that framework. And in future videos, I will also look at visual and multimodal and talk about the different considerations that you would have for those. Because as you move from textual to visual to multimodal, there's going to be an increasing number of possibilities in terms of rhetorical devices that you could point out as successfully or unsuccessfully helping to communicate a message. So the rest of this video is going to be pretty straightforward. I'm going to default to ChatGPT to kind of give me a topic. I'm going to find something randomly that has to do with that topic, and I'm going to do a rhetorical analysis of that. As I do that rhetorical analysis, I'm going to walk you through the process of outlining, gathering the relevant information for that analysis, as well as actually composing it and discussing some of the considerations that I would make or some of the ways that I would analyze information that I am pulling out of that document. So hopefully by the end of this video, you have a good sense about how to go about constructing a textual rhetorical analysis, some things to look for, how you might organize it, and ultimately be able to perform better when you're asked to do one. All right, so we're gonna take it to ChatGPT now and see what we can come up with. Creative juices are a little bit in decline here, so I'm just gonna give it something super basic. Oh, of course it's gonna give me just these things. Okay, I'll do one anyway. Should standardized testing be eliminated in schools? Is online education as effective as traditional classroom learning? Should college be free for all students? I think I'll probably just go with that. Should college be free for all students? And I'm just going to find an article about that. Hopefully, I can find one that's long enough, that's doing enough that I can do a good analysis. So I'm just going to skip that part because it's going to be super boring. And next thing you see is going to be the article on screen. All right, so I went through 2 or 3 articles before I landed on this one. A few reasons why I didn't use some of the others was because one was too long. It was an academic article, and it was going to be really hard to gather everything and distill that. You can absolutely do a rhetorical analysis on an academic article, but it obviously takes a lot more reading to get through everything. Some of the other ones I didn't choose because they were a bit too short. And it might seem like a good idea to use a short article because there's less to read, but that also means that there is less rhetorical that is happening in that article, just on account of there not being much to go on. So ultimately, I landed on this one, and some primary things that stood out to me with this one that got me to choose it is because A, I saw that it came from a reputable source, which it doesn't have to. Brookings Institution is a good source for information. But if this wasn't a good source, if it wasn't reputable, that would factor into my analysis of the document. It has a title that tells me pretty much word for word what the message is going to be, as well as a listed author, so I can do research on that and explore their ethos. Again, this is a situation where you don't necessarily need to have a listed author. In the case that you don't have an author, you can just default to the ethos of the publisher. So if this was an article with no author, I would just work on the ethos of Brookings Institution and use that as I'm developing their credibility. It also has a date, which is important to me for this specific topic, because I want it to be something recent, since information about colleges and affordability and opportunities for free college evolve year over year. And I didn't want something that was, say, a decade ago, where there's obviously going to be major changes, which is definitely discussed in this article. But then I just scroll down and I'm just looking for pieces of rhetoric that I can use. So coming down here, I'm looking for logos. I'm looking for anywhere where there is any argument that is made within this article. Typically, I'm looking for facts and data. For this specific article, at least, if it was a different article where the facts and data aren't really going to be readily available, then I might be looking for other clues. And those clues I would generally find within the structure of the paper. But going through here, I already see some numbers, some percentages. So I know that there is some logos. I know that there is logos specifically in the form of data and facts that I can use and analyze in how they contribute to the overall message and purpose of this article. I come down, I'm looking at the structure. I'm seeing that there's these bolded, highlighted points in here where this is going to give me a good idea about what's actually discussed in the article. So I just read each of these points to get a better understanding of it, even though I'm not going to be reading this article in depth immediately when I find it. I also see that there's these larger headings down here, which is also a good thing. I can use those to get an even better feel for what the narrative of this particular article is. So that's also good for me. I see a graph, chart, that's good. That means I'm going to have a lot more information in terms of logos, and I can actually talk about what this chart adds into the effectiveness of this text document. So again, another good thing. That's all I'm looking for. I'm skimming through, seeing if I can find anything that points to rhetorical devices that are used within this document. So now that I have all of that, I'm just going to scroll back up and I'm going to give it a more thorough read at some point eventually. But before that, I want to go back through it again and actually pinpoint and record each of the parts of the rhetorical situation that I can find within this document. I know that some people like to outline and some people don't, but I can guarantee you that anything that comes with an outline is probably going to be a lot better than something that doesn't come from an outline. Even if you don't follow that outline exactly as you have it, the process of generating those ideas and thinking about it is going to give you a lot more focus when you're writing a rhetorical analysis or really any other essay. So what I would recommend doing for a rhetorical analysis, and this is something that as you get better with rhetorical analysis and picking these things out, you might not need this outline as much, but when you're starting, I would recommend doing this. So I'm breaking this down into two parts: rhetorical situation and rhetorical devices. And all I'm doing with this is I am identifying each element of the rhetorical situation. I already have all that here. So speaker, Douglas N. Harris, there was information on the website that gave me his ethos. If I didn't have that, I might need to do a little bit of research to figure that out. Message, that was apparent from the title. Audience, I had to read through the document to see who he was addressing this to. But if it's not clear from the text who the audience is, then you might have to just extrapolate a potential audience based on what the message and the purpose is for that communication. Exigence. What gave this communicator a sense that they needed to produce this message? That's what that's about. And in this case, it was also communicated to me in the text. Harris gave me this information outright, but it's another case where if it's not evident from the text itself, you might have to make inferences based on what you know about the topic when it was published and figure out what might have been going on to trigger them to want to write this communication. Purpose, again, something else that can be explicit within the document, but also might require some extrapolation. From this, it's clear by the end that he does want to convince policymakers to consider reduced costs for college tuition for certain colleges. Medium, the forum that the communication appears on, web page in this case. If it was an article, then the medium would be a journal. Or if you were doing rhetorical analysis on a book, then the medium would be book. That part is pretty simple. For circulation, the way that this information gets from the speaker to the audience, from the speaker to me, is through the internet. So that's fine for circulation. Social media would be a secondary circulation. There were icons on the page so that you could share to the app formerly known as Twitter, Reddit, email, LinkedIn. So you can imagine that some people did probably circulate the message in that way. Modality, verbal because there's words that are being used, visual because I have to look at the words in order to receive the message. Genre, this was given to me on the article as commentary, but I would probably list this as opinion piece instead, so I just did both of those. If you don't know a specific word for a genre, then it can be okay to put a term or a phrase in that explains what that genre is. And then for context, citational, where does it appear? Does it appear in a place that is relevant? Brookings Institute talks a lot about education, so having an article about education appear there makes sense. Geographical, where exactly did the communication take place physically? It's an online article, so there's no physical location. That's not going to influence in any way the strength or weakness of this communication. Historical, what has happened recently in history, in time, that would convince this person to write this article or to create this communication. Historical context and exigence go hand in hand. So for this, recent political discussion about the efficacy of free college, this again was stated in this article. That was what happened historically on a public scale that promoted him to want to write this. And then sociocultural, what is the general zeitgeist of the time that would impact the relevance of this particular communication? There are right and wrong answers for this, but there can also be multiple right answers. So as long as it makes sense and you're exploring your communication through a lens that makes sense, it should be fine for sociocultural. In this case, COVID placing many people in financial hardship, that works because a lot of those people are wondering and stressed about whether or not they'll be able to afford college now that their families are burdened. There's also been a lot of talk about education reform, rising costs of tuition. These are things that people in general are concerned about, so that's part of that sociocultural context that I might consider for this rhetorical analysis. So that part's pretty easy as far as note-taking goes. Next part is looking at rhetorical devices. This is where I just go through and I find those rhetorical devices. I'll read a little bit deeper into the article to see if I can pick up as many as possible. For a text document, two of the most important things are going to be how it is structured, what the tone is, and where there's logos. I have not done a comprehensive, exhaustive exploration of everything for these notes, but I do have some things in here. I'm looking at how structure is informing the message, and in some cases, I'm having direct quotes from this article. I always recommend that if you are taking notes on an article, instead of paraphrasing things, always do direct quotes that you can easily go back and find what that note is referring to. So, list of structural elements that I feel are going to be important to the analysis. A list, again, not exhaustive, of elements of logos that feel like they are going to be significant to this analysis. And when I'm looking at this logos, I'm also looking at that in terms of what the structure is. What are the things that the author is focused on? What are their main ideas? That I can find through looking at the structure, and I can also find through finding commonalities, parts where the author is spending a lot of time talking about certain ideas. That's probably going to be the most important thing to focus on for logos. I just took down a few things so that I would have a sense of where I wanted to go. Pathos, not so much there. And the reason for that is because the tone, as I've indicated here, is formal and informative. And typically, if you approach writing with that kind of tone, you're not going to use as much pathos as you would for other genres of writing. Only a few points on diction and just one on compare and contrast. Both of those are also rhetorical tools that you can use. As you can see, there's only 6 items that I have on this list, and I'm probably not going to use pathos. That's okay. You work with what's available to you and you make the decision about its effectiveness based on those things. If you feel like including other elements, other rhetorical devices would help it, then it's worth noting those down too, because that can be part of your analysis. Things like alliteration, repetition, figurative language, similes, metaphors, personification, those can all work really well. But if they're not there, they're not there, and you don't need to feel obligated to find them or feel like you're going to perform worse on an analysis because you're not mentioning a long list of different rhetorical devices. And all of that process finally brings us here. All that note taking brings us to creating the actual outline for our essay. Like what you're analyzing, the rhetorical analysis that you produce is also a rhetorical document. You're making an argument for whether or not whatever you're analyzing is effective. This means that you're at full liberty to use whatever rhetorical devices you feel are necessary in order to get that point across. And again, that's what makes it more important to have some structure to it. So what I did is I just took all the notes that I took. I found the parts that were most relevant, the parts that I wanted to focus on in the analysis, and I divide them up into an outline of my essay. Obviously, you have an opening paragraph, and then I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 body paragraphs. This was initially going to be 3 body paragraphs, but I divided this up because structurally it made a little bit more sense to break them into these subcategories. So my first 2 paragraphs, body paragraphs that is, are both about structure, but one focuses on the general structure, the other one focuses on the subheading structure and what that adds to the document. Before I move into my final 2 body paragraphs that are talking about specific rhetorical devices. So we have 2 paragraphs that actually discuss logos. The first one is talking about logos in terms of how this isn't going to cost the government as much and how this might actually benefit the government and help them to make more money in the long term. And the second paragraph on logos is about student finance and figuring out really what the cost is to them, how it benefits students, and whether or not there's any drawbacks. Third body paragraph focuses specifically on the concluding paragraphs of this document, and then obviously my own conclusion down there. Now, this is a really brief, abridged outline, and I didn't follow this one-to-one as I actually wrote my rhetorical analysis, because obviously your ideas are going to change as you begin writing. New ideas might come to you, new ways of exploring the topics that you've laid out, and in some cases you might come up with completely new topics to add into your rhetorical analysis. So An outline like this doesn't mean that you have to commit to this outline. It just gives you focus to begin and move forward that you can develop as you continue to write. And that brings us to the actual rhetorical analysis. I have highlighted in yellow parts that I want to point out in terms of addressing the rhetoric of this document. And then the parts in blue are where I am expanding on these. Because it is not enough in a rhetorical analysis to point out what rhetorical tools are used. You need to also be able to identify how they're being used and or what they're accomplishing. I'm not going to go through this entire rhetorical analysis. I think this is roughly 1,500 words. I just threw it together real quick. It's a rough draft. I would definitely go back and make changes to this, but I am going to go through a few pages of this, of what I have highlighted, and just kind of explain what's going on there. I'm opening up this introduction with a declaration of fact, so it introduces the audience to the topic. It works to create some engagement, but it's probably not the traditional hook that you might be thinking of with an essay, like opening with a question or a quote. Those are ways that you can open up any essay, but they tend to be a little bit overused to the point where they feel a little bit cliche. I find that just a statement of fact like this is a much better way to open up an essay. Attending college is a goal that many high schoolers view as a rite of passage into independence and a stable future. It's a statement of fact. It has to do with the topic, and I can transition from that into the specifics of what I'm going to be analyzing. Also, next highlighted here, Douglas Harris. I've identified the author, scholar of education policy and economics. I've presented the ethos. His article for the Brookings Institution. I've mentioned that it is an article, so we understand what the genre is. For the Brookings Institution, we now know who the publisher is. Utilizes 10 years of research to assert that free college not only supports student growth, but is also financially viable. This doesn't take a lot of time, but I've already touched on several elements of the expanded rhetorical situation. That right there being the message. And then in this final sentence here, he leverages liberal use of research data with hopes of converting the idea into action. That's his purpose. So that should be what my analysis is focused around. Whether or not he's successful in converting this idea into action. And as I move down here, you can just see how this is divided, broken up into these yellow and blue highlights. Again, I want to make sure that it's clear that you can't just point out what's happening rhetorically. Explain it. So here he opens by providing historical context. This comparison implies unwillingness by the Republican Party to spend federal dollars to relieve financial burdens associated with quality of life benefits. That's what he's accomplishing by making this statement that I address in the previous sentence. So that's why I point that out. The same thing is true for this other highlighted portion. He hopes that this observation will curtail concerns with Republican lawmakers by appealing to their sensibilities. I am pointing out here in my analysis what Harris is doing in order to ingratiate himself to his target audience. The same thing is true the further down you go, talking about structure. I mention what the structure is, I describe it, so I point out that rhetorical tool, and then I explain what this rhetorical tool is accomplishing. And that's really how you should be focused on completing a rhetorical analysis as you are picking out each and every one of the different elements that you have outlined in your notes or in your outline. And if I just scroll down through this, you can see the pattern here where every time I am presenting something that is a rhetorical device, I am taking some time to explain it. You can get away with one sentence of explanation, but if you have more depth that you can add to it, typically it's better to have probably twice as much analysis at a minimum than you do pointing out rhetorical devices. We see that a little bit throughout here, and I don't have any highlights in these paragraphs here because I really am not going to go through the whole thing for this video. It would be a little bit too much. However, there is going to be a link to this video in the description, so you can just access this complete rough draft from there and see how I frame this rhetorical analysis from the beginning all the way down to the conclusion. You can analyze how it's structured and see how that functions and the way that I am approaching making my final determination about how successful this document is. Another part of the reason that I'm not going to go through step by step this textual analysis is because the work that you do creating your notes and creating an outline, when you're doing a rhetorical analysis, that should really tell someone everything they need to know about your position. it should at least put you in a position where you're comfortable to write your rhetorical analysis and be confident in the decision that you're coming to. And as long as all of that's in place, as long as you're able to express yourself properly and explain your rationales for why you think something is working as well as how it's working, then a rhetorical analysis should be fairly straightforward and simple for you. So if you want to see how all that process of note taking and creating an outline actually culminated in the final product, then just go ahead and look at the link to read the entire rhetorical analysis, skim through it, check how I am integrating different bits of information, how I'm integrating quotes, check to see how I'm analyzing things, how I'm supporting my position on the strength of this document by presenting alternatives or different rhetorical devices that could have been used to strengthen that position. But for now, that's all I got.